Okay, we're coming up to just after 10:15, so we're ready for our second session this morning. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the brief break. One of the things that worries me about interventions is that they're bolt-ons. The analogy I would draw is the car, and how for over many decades we'd kept adding things to make it better. Initially go faster, then be more fuel efficient, and more recently less polluting. But in the end, you have at the very center the core, and there comes a point where it's the core elements that matter most, not bolting things onto it. And in the case of the car, the engine. But in the case of us in education, it's teaching and learning every day in the classroom. And that's why I'm delighted to welcome Ruth Powley, one of the schools who are Whole Education Network members. And she's author of Powerful Pedagogy. And I love the subtitle, Ruth, for the book, Teach Better Quicker. And what she's going to talk with us this morning about is how to develop and understand better the craft of teaching, and to close the gap between pedagogical research and classroom delivery and practice. So Ruth, in a short period of time this morning, can you share with us how we can all teach better quicker? Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you very much. I'm just waiting, I think, for Alex to get my slides up. So as the slides come up, you'll see that this session talks about catch-up pedagogy and how we actually need to be rebuilding our learning as we enter what is going to be a very unusual year. So if I could have the next slide, please, Alex. I'm talking in this presentation briefly about the things that we're going to all need to focus on next year. And the first focus for all of us is it's going to need to be a year for what works, because our students don't have time for us to be thinking about anything else. When I wrote the book, Powerful Pedagogy, Teach Better Quicker, of course I had no idea that this year was going to be coming. And the book was written in a context of feeling that it was really important that as teachers, we're not being misled by a lack of understanding about pedagogy. But in the circumstances that we now find ourselves in, that's even more important, because our instruction next year will need to be more powerful. And it will need to be more powerful because we will be dealing with a number of barriers for our students. And it's important that we understand what those barriers will be in the classroom, and that we're able to address them through our understanding of pedagogy and through our teaching. And I think it's really important that we're aware of this and we're approaching this as professionals. Sometimes there can be quick fixes peddled in education, which are very seductive because they seem quick and they seem easy, and they promise us all sorts of things. But I think our experience is that actually that they're not effective. And one of the things that I love about the work that Whole Education do is it's not about those quick fixes and silver bullets. Obviously I'll be talking about some of the ideas in Powerful Pedagogy that I think there are over 100 ideas that I've tried to collate about how one can teach more quickly. But also I would like to flag up another book that I think is really important in this, and certainly something that has very much informed my thinking. And that is Michael Young's work on powerful knowledge, because again, I think that this is a year where our students really need to understand curriculum, where we really need to understand curriculum for our students. It's very important that this is a year of broad and ambitious curriculum. It's very important that we don't sacrifice our curriculum in sort of quick fix interventions. And it's very important that we understand some of the building blocks of our curriculum. I haven't referred in this presentation to threshold concepts, but I am going to mention them now as I talk about curriculum. I think that it's really, really important that as we think about progression for our students, we are very aware of what the threshold concepts are in each of our subjects and how we are actually building upon those, because we are not going to have the same amount of time that we would normally have for our students. And our students have lost out on a lot of their education over the last year as well. So if I could have the next slide, please. I've said it's a year for what works. I also think it is a year for keeping it simple. I don't think it is a year for the complicated. And therefore, I think we need to be going back to the key building blocks and the key principles of what makes effective teaching and learning. And so in our school, we have picked these 4 areas because we believe that they are the nuts and bolts, if you like, of effective teaching practice, wherever you are doing it and wherever your students are. So they have been our focus. The explanation has needed, it's interesting, we've looked at these 4 areas in terms of where we're able to do them. Explanation ideally needs to be in the classroom. If not, we've thought about ways we can make our explanation more effective through live lessons and through video lessons. Practice flips more easily, and it's important that we understand that. Questioning and feedback does not flip more easily. We've struggled with that. We've struggled with how we get effective questioning and feedback in remote settings. And so again, where we're able to be delivering in the classroom, questioning and feedback are vital there. And again, assessment and retrieval, we have found can flip more easily. Can I have the next slide, please? And so what we're doing at the moment is we are investing in our inset. I think that it was Hannah who referred this morning to the importance of taking time. We do need to take time at the start of next year to get it right. And there'll be 2 things that we should be thinking about in terms of the classroom. One is taking the time to get our curriculum modification right. We are going to need to modify our curriculums, and we're going to need to think carefully about how we do that in a way that preserves the threshold concepts and preserves the heart of the curriculum while being manageable for our teachers and manageable for our students. And we need to devote the proper time to that. We don't just need to be chopping at curriculum, because that will not be effective. We also need to be thinking about the importance of our pedagogy. We are going to need to teach differently, and it's important that we're aware of that and we're planning for that. If I could have the next slide, please. The 2 slides that you've just seen are ways that we are already starting to think and plan at Wilmslow about how we address this through our remote learning plans and through our focus on the 4 key areas. And again, if I can have the next slide, please. What we're also doing is thinking about the 4 areas in terms of delivery in the 4 different settings that we may be facing next year. And it's very important that we're aware that those 4 different settings will require different types of teaching and learning and a different pedagogical focus. So I've deliberately talked about proximate and non-proximate teaching because I think they're very important. We use proximity in our teaching. It is a powerful engagement tool. It is a powerful behaviour tool. And at 2 meters away from our students, we won't have it as we move into September. So we need to think about how we are proximate to our students in non-physical ways. And that involves thinking about the power and the emphasis of our explanation and how we are using our oracy in order to communicate with our students. We need obviously to think about being prepared for going back to remote learning. And that's important. We need to think about delivering our pedagogy through the live experiences, as I'm doing now. We really need to be ramping up our formative assessment. Formative assessment will be vital as we go into next year. And we really need to be focusing on our oracy. Our students have not had oracy. They have not had the academic language that they would normally be getting in a day-to-day school setting, and we need to think about how we reintroduce that through all of these 4 areas. And we need to think about learner passivity. A number of our students will have become very passive in their learning, and how we engage and motivate them through each of these 4 different scenarios will be really important. And we must be thinking for all 4 if we're to be fully prepared for next year. If I could have the next slide, please. I think it's also really important that we concretize this for our students. What does catch-up look like? How many hours are we talking about? What does that look like in the classroom? John referred to flipped learning. Flipped learning has become really, really important in the current climate. It can't just be a word that we bandy around as a nice add-on or extra. It has become central. And what does assessment look like, and where do we make the spaces for that? Because we will have lost a sense of where our students are. And it's really important we get that sense back quickly of where they are so that we can support them. And as we've said already in the sessions so far, they'll be all over the place. Some of them will be forging ahead and will have taken opportunities to really engage with their learning. Others of them will really, really have fallen behind. And so we will be dealing with great gaps and great diversity. If I could have the next slide, please. As we then move on to the serious pedagogy, and again, the fact that teaching is not easy. It was always, it's a profession, it's always been difficult. This is possibly the most challenging year that we've ever faced as teachers, but in that lies an excitement and a challenge for us in meeting the needs of our students. So as I go back to the 4 areas I touched upon, for explanation, our understanding of dual coding is going to be really important. I'm actually not doing it now because I shouldn't be talking to you at the same time that I'm showing you writing. I am, and I'm going to carry on doing that because my drawing is appalling. But that understanding of dual coding and that understanding of how we craft an effective live lesson or how we craft an effective video for our students, we need to be really investing in high quality resources and designing high quality teaching resources for our students. And so if I can have the next slide, please. Making sure that all of our teachers are clear about how you actually produce high quality written and visual information for students, because they're going to need that this year. And again, investing the time in that. And we can be very smart about this. This doesn't mean that 20 different teachers need to produce 20 different videos. It's really important we're being collaborative and we're thinking smartly. So I won't dwell on these slides now as I'm moving swiftly through this, but if I move on to the next slide, David Didau and Nick Rose wrote a very good book a couple of years ago, exploring more of the psychology behind teaching and learning. And this is a good time for us not just to know our pedagogy, but this is a good time to know more about the psychology of teaching and learning. There are also a couple of very good clips, they're about an hour long each, that I've included on these slides, which talk a bit more about how dual coding can be used in the classroom if this is something that you're interested in for your school. So if I move on to the next slide, again, cognitive load theory. Cognitive load theory is not new, but this is a really relevant time for cognitive load theory because our students are going to need our understanding. One of the interesting risks of catch-up is we try to cram too much in. When we've been looking at our provision for students, we've kept our lessons to 40 minutes of delivery, not 90 minutes delivery. And one of the reasons for that is in our context, in our school, to bring our students straight back into 3 90-minute sessions, they would drown, they would flounder. For many of them, it's too much. And so thinking carefully about cognitive load in terms of our planning, I think is important. And essentially, it's the idea that there are 3 phases of learning and different learning activities are relevant at different times. And it's also worth in this context going back to the model I spoke about, the remote learning or the proximate classroom delivery, etc. Because you'll see that there are some challenges for learning within remote learning. Student self-explanation is a really important feature of learning, but how do you create effective self-explanation in a remote learning setting? That's where we need to be thinking more about peer discussion, about opportunities for students' oracy, I think oracy has been one of the real victims of the current situation because students have not had space or opportunities to speak, and we need to be thinking about how we create those and use that academic register and get that back. And again, the opportunities for developing automaticity and speed and accuracy, which I actually think are easier to achieve in the current context. So if I could move on to the next slide, please. Again, if you're interested in more about this and more about the sort of research behind it, I've included a couple of links there. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Assessment. Our assessment is going to be crucial next year. And I think we start with formative assessment. I don't think we bring our students back and put them straight into high stakes summative assessment. I think it will depress them. I think it will depress us. And so low stakes formative assessment to understand where the learning gaps are is going to be really important. And I think we need to be thinking about how we record that, because this is not about numbers. This is about thinking about curriculum coverage. This is about thinking about where concepts might be understood more securely or less securely. At Wilmslow, we talk about complete learning and we talk about the need for fluency and thinking carefully about the fluency of our students and where their gaps are, and then how we need to modify our curriculum. And building time into our time budgets for appropriate curriculum modification based on the formative assessment we've done are going to be really important. And so I think it's worth looking at the different types of assessment we're going to need to be doing, and again, where they need to be classroom based and where you can flip them. And so my suggestion would be the importance of the hinge question in the classroom, whereas other types of practice and assessment can be flipped and should be flipped, because our time in the classroom is going to be valuable, and there are things that we need to be ensuring are happening more in the classroom, such as student oracy. So if I could move on to the next slide, please. Daisy Christodoulou writes a very good book about the difference between formative and summative assessment and where we should be doing both. Again, it's pre-COVID, it's pre-lockdown, but it might be worth a read if you're interested in really getting to grips with a sense of assessment. Moving on to the next slide. Again, retrieval and testing for students, building their confidence, building their knowledge. It's really important that we approach this next year positively for our students so that they know it's going to be okay, that we're going to get through this, and that sense of them knowing things. There's no point in us telling our students things that are not true. There's no point in saying to them, do you know what, there isn't a challenge here, because they know that. They know there are things that they don't know. They know there are things that their learning is insecure in. What we need to be doing is giving them a plan that they have confidence in, that we can deliver for them. And so thinking about how we are building their fluency and building their sense of knowledge. And again, thinking about where that fits in the, in our planning for next year. One of the things that we're thinking about in Wilmslow is assessment around the driving test model. The driving theory test model, that you have spaces to resit, you have spaces to improve, you have spaces to gain fluency. And so I actually think that thinking about assessment next year is an important one. If I could move on to the next slide, again, there is some of the research information there at the links. It's not new, but it's worth perhaps going back to. And then if I could have the next slide, please. I'm really excited about next year because this is a year for us to be creative. This is a year for us to do what we do best. The DFE have demonstrated very nicely that there's no easy answer to teaching and learning. There's no quick fix government paper out there that addresses the problems that we've got. We need to solve this for our students. We can do it by being creative. I think we do it by starting at the end and thinking about what we want to achieve for them. I think we do it by abandoning the frills. There are things we don't need to be doing next year, and we can be zero-based, and we can think about actually what matters for this year. I think that we can be collaborative and work together and innovate. And I actually think that if we go back to the pedagogy, go back to actually good teaching and learning, we have real opportunities here that will not just get us through next year, but actually will strengthen our teaching and learning for students as we move forward into the future. So the final slide, I'm aware that I've rushed through a lot there, but I hope that my positivity for this and my excitement for this have come across. And I do believe there are real opportunities for our teaching and learning in the current situation. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ruth. Wow, that was absolutely tremendous, and the positivity just rushed through. You certainly don't need government to tell you what to do. It's in our hands. Seize the agenda. All of those things. Three things struck with me from that: the notion of proximity learning, and the fact that classrooms may have less proximity than virtual going forward. This bit about cognitive loading, I mean, less can be more. And I think it's a lesson we don't learn. I think there's a real risk that colleagues will try and pack everything in to fill the time they've missed. But I think having a mantra, less being more, is very powerful. And the third thing to me is the potential and impact of formative assessment. To me, summative assessment is a bit like a post-mortem for a dead person, little use. It may help inform what you do in future, but formative assessment is the most powerful assessment. Lots and lots of things in there. And I think what it brings home to us, Ruth, is this is where our energy should perhaps go more into our teachers and staff and their adaptation and need to the new environments. We know teachers make the most difference to students. It's a blindingly obvious thing, but it shines out in all the research. And leaders second. Well, the role of leaders is to create an environment where teachers can make the most difference. And for the last two inputs of this session, I'm going to invite two colleagues from the network to share what they're doing with their staff. And certainly my message would be, don't leave it to chance, and look at how you support and give scaffolding. And also there was tucked away in Ruth's comments, that comment about collaboration. Don't expect everybody to be good at all aspects of it. Let people play to their strengths and plan around it. John, do you want to add and share a little bit about what you've been doing to support staff in their transition?
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks very much, Ruth. It was really interesting to listen to. We have a very comprehensive professional development programme for all of our staff, which Tuesday nights is sort of sacrosanct. We do professional development. There's been a lot of face-to-face or small group meetings. And when we went into this process of sort of isolation and lockdown, one thing that came through from a member of staff actually was the fact that she felt very isolated, but was doing an incredible amount of personal learning going on, doing courses, and then looking at what she could do and the impact she could make. And I'm an avid TED Talk watcher. I watch ridiculous amounts of TED Talks. I love them. Just for the diversity and that 15 minutes where somebody can just stand there and really like push forwards an idea, a thought, a process, or something they've achieved. And I find it really motivational. So we decided in our digital online world to go TED Talk. So since lockdown, about 2 weeks into lockdown, we started every Tuesday at 3 p.m. We have TED Talks. I actually produce it. The person leading it just talks. It's really good because they don't have an audience in front of them. Lots of staff like that actually, because they don't feel as intimidated. They produce PowerPoints, presentations, videos, and it's linked to teaching and learning and a best practice network. So they're sharing ideas on marking techniques, theories to do with memory, and then how we can use theories on memory to catch up once we have our students coming back with us. We've got using escape rooms as a teaching and learning technique. As you've seen earlier, I was talking about 4D learning. That was one of the TED Talks, slightly outside the 15 minutes, I must say. But what it's seen is that staff who've missed it at 3 o'clock when it goes out live, we put it into a bank now, and now we've got a bank of resources building up, which we're putting onto Teams. So staff watch it in their time, when it's right for them. It might be that during the day at 3 o'clock, they've just picked up the kids from school, they haven't got time to watch it at that point, but they pick it up the next day, that night, or whenever. So this idea of flexible working and flexible approaches, and now we've got a list running ready for September, because we're not going to do face-to-face training. We're actually going to develop our TED Talks even more, so that we have a huge open source bank for people to draw on and to use to enable them to share best practice, ideas, theories, something that just really floats their boats, or an amazing lesson. So we're getting much more of a learning community approach in a flexible way. And I don't think we would have got that unless we'd seized the opportunity of lockdown and thought, yeah, it's a brave new world, let's go forwards. So that's our approach, David, and I hope it's made sense.
This notion of seizing the agenda and the opportunity runs through very powerfully. I'm looking, there's lots of obviously comments emerging on chat. Do keep adding your comments and observation, and panelists, please reply, as I know you are, to many as we go along. But staff are our most important asset, and learning and supporting their learning in different ways. I mean, as we're modeling in some ways this morning, just think how, although it's nice to travel to conferences and things, how much time and energy we've saved. I think one of the messages when people are back in schools is to still allow people to have inset in this form without necessarily traveling. Over to Shona. I know you put a lot of energy too in how you support your staff. Would you like to share? Shona from Ansford Academy, this is actually, she'll be doing a bigger input in the next session. Shona, would you like just to join us and share some of your reflections on supporting and developing staff?
Absolutely. So I think it's really important that I set the context of what I'm about to say in how we prepared staff before we even went into lockdown. So for us at Ansford, we did a lot of work on establishing the organisational mindset before we even went into lockdown. And that was around establishing that the school was going to be open. It just wasn't going to be physically open, and that Ansford is more than just a school that delivers education. It's the centre of its community. And we had to try and find ways as staff of making the school run exactly as it would physically in the virtual realm, and do all of the things that our parents and our kids needed us to do, and we needed each other to do in that new world, rather than assuming that everything was closed and we just had to cope. That's really important in how we've helped staff to get through lockdown. So that normalising of, we are still going to be staff, we're still going to be running our school. We need to find ways together creatively of being hopeful about how we can do that and how we can hold everyone together through all of this. It's worth saying as well that we were a school who already were developing huge amounts of virtual capacity before we went into lockdown. So we'd done huge amounts of training with staff about how they could use technology, how they could use Google particularly to support students with their learning. And lockdown pushed us over the edge into having to do that. So we'd done the training and not used it in a lot of areas. And so we haven't had to do a huge amount of training on the hoof. We've just had to encourage staff that they do know what they're doing. They have got the capability within their gift to be able to make it work. For me, it was about trying to maintain normality, but then giving people permission to find their own rhythm. And that being for both students and for staff, giving them permission to achieve what we needed to achieve in a way that worked for them. And also setting the boundaries around, you know, we'll be available now. We won't be available in the middle of the night if you decide to do your learning at a different time. And so setting those boundaries for our community so that staff had time and space to be themselves and to manage the challenges that were coming for them. In terms of transitioning back, that's really relevant because some of our staff love working from home. Some of them are really thriving in lockdown. And so we've got one group of staff who are going to find the transition back really tough because they found their niche. They found their way of teaching in a different way. And we do live lessons. We do Google Hangout lessons. So our kids are in the lesson with the teacher in a live interaction. Some are desperate to return, but they're not desperate to return to what they're coming back to. They're desperate to return to a world that doesn't exist anymore. And there's a challenge there around how we move them on to a situation where they won't have their own classroom for the first, most simple demonstration of that. And there's a piece of work to do there. But also, there's a bit around the people who are desperate to come back, but who don't know where they fit anymore. They haven't got the usual toolkit that Ruth was talking about. You know, they know how they used to teach. They know how they teach virtually, but they're yet to imagine how that might look. For us, we're a school that's all about relationships. We're all about individuals and people being able to be themselves and to find a way through. And so for us, it's very much going to be about taking the time, coaching, helping people to find their new way of being them. And, you know, I'm really excited. I'm really hopeful. The thing that destroys my hope is thinking we have to go back and catch up, because actually we're not behind. Our kids have been learning, and some of them have learned significantly more than we ever would have hoped, just different stuff. And so I get destroyed by that mentality rather than by the possibilities of how we might be able to move forward, really.
Shona, that last comment is the most powerful. I think if we banned the word catch up, I think we'd be doing our students a real favour. I think they have capacity and resilience with our support to be able to make up any deficit. And to be honest, a lot of the things we may, not in our schools, of course, crammed into them, they don't hold in their memory. John's comment a little earlier about learning by doing, the best way you remember things is internalizing them through experiencing them for real, very much a whole ed concept. Let's spend the last part of this session on some of the questions that are rising. Ruth asked, Ruth, could you, for a couple of our colleagues, just define and go back to that area of proximate learning again, and just say, give your definition of it? Because I must admit, when you first said it, I thought proximity would be in the classroom, then you dispelled it. So just say a few more words about that.
Yeah, it's the sense, if for those of us who've been in the sort of socially distanced classroom, and you are 2 meters apart from students as a teacher, the students will obviously be able to be a bit closer together in September, but we're still going to be expected to be socially distant. And so if you think about all of the ways you communicate with students through proximity, so, you know, the tap on the desk to a student to draw their attention back, the way that you move through a classroom when you're explaining something, the way that you connect with students, the importance to students of engage, you know, that way that you use your body in a way to engage with students. We have lost some of those things, and we've not just lost them on Zoom. And I do take on board what people have said, that for some students, live learning can provide an opportunity that they feel more comfortable with, but the whole point of this is the diversity. And I think for our students, school is a more alien space, and will be a more alien space as we start next year than it has previously been. And I think that we need to think, therefore, about ways that we're able to actually reach out to our students more through our understanding, through the way we use our voices, through the way we use our oracy, through the way that we are expressive with them, because we won't be able to teach in quite the same way that we might usually have taught in. The whole point about social distancing is there are boundaries, and the whole point of teaching is reaching out across boundaries. And so I just think it is worth us thinking about delivery. I really liked the point about we need to be investing in our teachers at the minute, and we need to be investing in our understanding of teaching at the minute. We can't just assume that we're going to walk into a classroom and do what we've always done, and it's going to be exactly what's needed at this moment in time.
Thank you, Ruth. And that takes me really to one of the questions, in an area that those of you who suffered me before is passionate about. We shouldn't add this to what we do already. I often talk about the concept of abandonment and redeployment of existing resource, and the biggest resource in our schools is our staff. So I think this is a time to think what we stop doing. I mean, John referred to it also. Things that don't make a difference or don't do it. This is quite a complex management issue in many ways, because often the things that people do already are part of people's being. It's the job they do in school, and they've worked hard on those things for time. That's the management issue and the leadership issue. But one of the most important things we do is not simply add what to do already. I think Kate asked for us to define what zero basing means. I've forgotten who said zero basing now in the presentation. It was probably Ruth. It's a very easy concept. Is you start with a blank sheet and start and build again, even if it's only a symbolic blank sheet. I don't know, do you want to give an example of zero basing, Ruth, perhaps?
On my blog, I actually wrote something about zero-based teaching a couple of years ago that I'm happy to share with people. It appealed to me. I think it's a financial term, but it appealed to me for the reasons that David says, that this is a moment to actually think, what do we not need to do at the moment? So, for example, I talked about invigilation. I talked about assessment. One of the things we do for our students is we allow them opportunities to practice exams in a low stakes setting, because we have students who get very anxious about the concept of assessment. And we do that by not bothering, for example, with the normal rules of invigilation and having a certain number of people and doing it in a certain way, because it allows us to do more for our students. So I just think that for zero basing, it's thinking, where do we want, what do our students need from us? And it's taking away anything that we don't need to be doing at the moment, and just stripping back in exactly the way that David said, and being prepared to be creative leaders in that. You know, being prepared to think, it's been lovely, I think, in schools as leaders that our staff have looked to us, and they are looking to us to get through this. And I think it's really important that we're just thinking, what do we need to do and what do we not need to do, and giving them the time and space and energy that they can be creative, because it will be our teachers in the classroom who provide what our students need, and our job is to give them that space.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. I mean, a simple thing to ask staff is to give them a blank sheet of paper and pose some of the key questions we've been talking about this morning, and saying, with a blank sheet of paper and no constraints, how would you do it? Now, it doesn't mean you haven't got to put some of those constraints back in. I mean, John alluded to length of lesson. I in a quite difficult school, went for 100-minute lessons for the same principle. Not only does it reduce the rigors of movement, but that does mean that you have to think about how you use those blocks of times. Ruth comments about 40 minutes. You can have a longer lesson, but you don't treat it as one whole block of time. I mean, primary schools obviously have practiced that over time. I wanted to come back a minute with Shona, that many students have enjoyed the learning environment they've had during lockdown. Do you want to just reflect a little bit more on that, Shona?
Yeah, so picking up on something Ruth said, actually, I think school is alien to quite a lot of children in normal times, because school is much more rigid than any other experience they ever have in their real lives. And we've got a very old-fashioned way of doing schooling in a world that has changed phenomenally. I was reflecting on the fact that education is now 100 years old in the model that we understand it. And I was thinking, if you had some people who were part of education back then walk into a school, they'd probably recognize what we do. But if you had them out in the world, they'd have no concept of what was going on. And that seems really peculiar. So some of our kids, you know, even you could just categorize it into the kids who are quiet, the introverts in our community, have really liked not having all of the noise going on around them. Just at that very basic level, some people are actually calmer than they've ever been, because they're not being bombarded constantly by people who make noise all the time. And, you know, as a profession, we're fairly noisy. You know, you only have to sit in some people's lessons as an introvert, as the observer, and I am an introvert, and hear how loud they talk to know how overstimulated some of our community are. So, you know, for all sorts of different reasons, that's just a very basic example, but all sorts of reasons, kids are finding the freedom and the flexibility to be able to set their own rhythm, to think about how their day needs to be structured, to have the support of their really trusted teachers and colleagues in Hangouts when they need them, but also the time and flex to be able to do the other things they love. Really exciting. And, you know, that's not about deficit for me. That's about finding a new way of thinking about the future.
I would share that with you, Shona. I think given a choice now, if I was still running a school, I wouldn't want to have the fixed mode of delivery, a teacher in front of a class of 25 or so for 5 times a day. I'd go by choice for more flexible models that doesn't have to be a face-to-face in that locked rigid model. And I do think it's an opportunity. We you know, that notion that you could pick up a teacher from the 19th century and put them in front of a classroom, although it would be a whiteboard and a pen rather than a piece of chalk, the model is remarkably similar. As we approach the second break, one of the things, and we're halfway through the session, I wondered if you'd just spend a moment, those of you who are with us, just reflecting on what your key 1 or 2 takeaways are from the morning so far. So your 1 or 2 personal takeaways from the morning so far, and capture them on the chat, and it will give us a real sense of what you're thinking. The other thing is, on mornings like this, there's almost a barrage of ideas. I'm in awe of much of the learning that I've picked up and the challenges to reflection so far this morning. One of the things that Whole Ed is good about is not just about acting as a catalyst, but is spending time working with people over time on developing and implementing these changes. And a lot of our programs and work in smaller groups throughout the year are about doing that. And also the notion is, if you want to make a significant change, you don't have to change about the whole school at once. And I often think change things in the proximity to you and in areas you can make a difference in. And if it's successful, like a good virus rather than a bad virus, it spreads. And that's one of the things I'd say to you is, don't think it can't be done. Don't try and change overnight. Many of the people who've been talking, this is a significant work they've been working on over time. And think about something you can do and make a difference, and then build on it. That would be some of my advice. But as we go into the second break, please share your reflections on 1 or 2 key takeaways from you. Remembering you can do anything but not everything. We'll all be back together in 15 minutes. Can I thank the 3 participants in our second session? And we're going to dig away at how IT may be able to make a difference, but also its limitations from people who have worked hard to help it make a difference. And we'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Shona. Thank you, John. Welcome back, Les. Les, that was recorded just then, and I know certainly from what I've heard you speak about, etc., it'd be well worth watching that session's video. I appreciate you had a
thank you.
Secondary heads sort of thing, but certainly, yeah, I know that will resonate with you and the team. So we've just got our break now. Lots of people are putting in things in the chat for takeaways. So thank you to everybody who's putting those in. I just want to say, James and Dan, are you there behind?
Absolutely, Lisa. Yeah. Hello. Yeah.
Brilliant, fantastic. James and Dan, I don't know, obviously, what Ruth was saying about the sort of the way that you gather information about the young people that's not in a high-stake exam type environment or system or process. There may be opportunities for you to explore that further, because I know obviously you work very closely with Wilmslow.
I'll bring you in, Dan, in the next session, perhaps in the introduction, just as a reflect back before we begin, because I wanted to keep to time in this one. I was about to do it, but yeah, I'd like
absolutely.
To.
No,
okay.
no problem at all, Dave. That'd be great.
Okay. Can we have a holding slide, Alex, please?
Okay, thank you, everybody. I shall just go blank for a moment and then see you back in about 10 minutes.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, Ruth, you're staying with us, yes?
Yes, I'll stay.
Brilliant,
I'll
thank
have
you.
A quick break now. See you later.
Thank you.